The crystal chandelier above my head cast rainbow prisms across the White House dining room as I reached for my water glass, trying to steady my trembling hands. Just 18 months ago, I was sitting alone in my studio apartment on Christmas Day, banned from my own family's celebration, watching their happy photos flood social media while I ate microwave lasagna in silence. Now here I was, sharing a meal with the President of the United States, and I knew my family was watching every second on live television. My name is Isa Martinez, and I'm a documentary filmmaker who spent 5 years investigating government corruption. What started as a passion project to expose small-town political scandals ended up uncovering a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of federal government. But this story isn't really about corruption or politics, it's about how sometimes the family that rejects you isn't the family you're meant to have. The beginning of my exile started 3 Christmases ago when I made what my family called the biggest mistake of my life. I had been working as a local news reporter in my hometown of Cedar Falls, Iowa, content with covering school board meetings and county fair competitions. My family, my parents Maria and Robert, my older sister Linda, and my younger brother Carlos, thought I had the perfect safe job that would never cause any trouble. They couldn't have been more wrong. It was during a routine assignment covering the mayor's budget announcement that I noticed something odd. The numbers didn't add up, and when I started asking questions, doors began slamming shut faster than I could knock on them. Mayor Richardson, a family friend who had bounced me on his knee when I was little, suddenly refused to return my calls. City council members who used to wave at me in the grocery store would cross the street to avoid me. But instead of backing down, I did what any good journalist would do. I dug deeper. The deeper I dug, the more uncomfortable my family became. Isa, honey, maybe you should just leave this alone, my mother would say during our weekly dinners, her voice tight with worry. Mayor Richardson is a good man. His family goes to our church. My father would nod in agreement, adding that some stones were better left unturned. Linda would roll her eyes and mutter about how I always had to make everything complicated, while Carlos would just stare at his plate and say nothing. But I couldn't let it go, not when I discovered that over $2 million in federal grant money designated for low-income housing had simply vanished. My investigation revealed a web of corruption that started with Mayor Richardson but extended far beyond our small town. The missing grant money had been funneled through a series of shell companies, all owned by people with connections to Richardson's political network. When I published my first exposé in the Cedar Falls Gazette, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Half the town praised me for my courage, the other half treated me like I had personally betrayed every resident. Unfortunately, my family fell squarely into the second camp. How could you do this to us? Linda screamed during what would become our last family dinner before everything fell apart. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? I can't even go to the grocery store without people staring at me and whispering. Her face was red with anger and embarrassment, and I could see she meant every word. My mother sat quietly crying into her napkin while my father's jaw worked silently, a sure sign that he was furious but trying to control his temper. Carlos just looked at me with disappointment and said, I thought family was supposed to stick together, Isa. This isn't sticking together. The final blow came when my investigation uncovered something I never expected to find. My own father's construction company had unknowingly been used as a front for some of the money laundering. Dad's business partner, a man he had trusted for over 20 years, had been falsifying invoices and routing dirty money through their joint accounts. When federal investigators showed up at Dad's office with a search warrant, he called me at work, his voice broken and raw. Are you happy now, Isa? They're treating me like a criminal because you crusade for truth. I hope it was worth destroying your own family. I tried to explain that I had no idea his company was involved, that I would never have pursued the story if I had known it would hurt him. But the damage was done. Dad's business was cleared of any wrongdoing after a thorough investigation. But the stress and public humiliation had taken their toll. He developed stress-related heart problems and had to close the company he had spent 30 years building. My mother blamed me entirely, telling me through tears that I had chosen strangers over family and that she didn't know how to forgive me. That first Christmas after the scandal broke, I expected things to be tense, but I never imagined I would be completely shut out. I called my mother 3 days before Christmas to ask what time dinner would be served, and she was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she said, "Asa, I think it would be better if you didn't come this year. Everyone is still too hurt, and your presence would just make things worse." When I asked if she meant just Christmas dinner or the entire holiday, she said quietly, "I think you should stay away until people have had time to heal. Maybe next year." Next year turned into the year after that, and then the year after that. Each December, I would call, hopefully, only to be told that the family wasn't ready yet. Linda would occasionally text me updates about her kids or share photos on social media, but she made it clear that these were one-way communications. Carlos stopped responding to my messages entirely. Dad refused to come to the phone when I called, and Mom's conversations became shorter and more strained each time until she finally stopped answering my calls altogether. Those first 2 Christmases alone were the darkest periods of my life. I had moved to Chicago after losing my job at the Cedar Falls Gazette. Apparently, exposing corruption doesn't make you popular with advertisers who depend on those corrupt officials for business contracts. I found work freelancing for various publications, but the loneliness was crushing. I would watch Christmas movies and sob, not because they were sad, but because they reminded me of everything I had lost. Social media became a form of torture as I watched my family's Christmas celebrations unfold in real time, seeing my nieces and nephews growing up without me, watching my parents age in photos where everyone looked happy except for the obvious gap where I should have been. But isolation has a way of clarifying what really matters, and for me, that clarity came in the form of an unexpected phone call from a whistleblower in Washington, D.C. Dr. Patricia Chan was a policy analyst for the Department of Housing and Urban Development who had been following my corruption exposés online. She reached out because she had discovered that the Cedar Falls case wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a much larger scheme involving dozens of cities across the Midwest, all following the same pattern of missing federal grant money and shell company cover-ups. "I've been trying to get someone to listen to me for 2 years," Dr. Chan told me during our first phone conversation. "But every time I bring this to my supervisors, the investigation gets shut down or reassigned. I think there are people at very high levels who don't want this story to come out." She had compiled evidence showing that over $50 million in federal housing grants had been systematically diverted over 5 years, with the scheme reaching into multiple state governments and potentially into federal agencies themselves. Working with Dr. Chen became my lifeline during those lonely years. Here was someone who understood the importance of truth over comfort, who valued justice over maintaining the status quo. We spent months communicating through encrypted emails and secure phone calls, slowly building a case that we both knew could change everything, or destroy us both. Dr. Chen was risking her career and potentially her freedom by sharing classified information with me, while I was risking what little professional reputation I had left by pursuing a story that could easily be dismissed as conspiracy theory nonsense. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen discovered that one of the key figures in the money laundering scheme was scheduled to testify before a congressional subcommittee about housing policy reform. Marcus Webb, the director of the Midwest Regional Development Authority, had been instrumental in approving the fraudulent grants, but his testimony was going to focus on the success of the housing initiative without mentioning the missing funds. Dr. Chen realized that if I could get my evidence to the right people before Webb's testimony, we might be able to expose the entire conspiracy at the congressional level. Getting the attention of Congress turned out to be easier said than done. I sent my research to every member of the housing subcommittee, but most offices didn't even acknowledge receiving it. The few that responded sent form letters thanking me for my interest in housing policy, without indicating they had actually read the evidence. I was beginning to think the story would die in congressional bureaucracy when I received an unexpected call from Congresswoman Janet Morrison's chief of staff. "Ms. Martinez, the Congresswoman has reviewed your research, and she would like to meet with you in person," the chief of staff told me. "Can you be in Washington next week?" I could barely believe what I was hearing. Congresswoman Morrison was the ranking minority member of the Housing Subcommittee and had a reputation for taking on difficult investigations that other politicians avoided. If she were willing to listen, there might actually be hope for exposing the truth. Meeting with Congresswoman Morrison changed everything. She was a small woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, and she asked questions that showed she had not only read my research but understood its implications completely. "Ms. Martinez," she said after we had talked for over an hour, "if even half of what you've uncovered is true, this represents one of the largest federal fraud cases in recent history. But I need you to understand that pursuing this will make you a target. People with this much to lose don't give up without a fight." She was right about making me a target. Within a week of my meeting with Congresswoman Morrison, my apartment was broken into. Though nothing was stolen, someone had clearly been looking for my research files. My computer was hacked, and I started noticing the same cars parked outside my building on multiple days. Dr. Chan reported similar harassment, including threatening phone calls and suspicious activity around her home. We both realized that we had crossed a line from which there was no going back. Congresswoman Morrison assigned her best investigative team to work with us, and over the next 6 months, we built an airtight case that connected the missing housing funds to a network of politicians, contractors, and government officials across 7 states. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity. Federal grant money would be approved for legitimate housing projects, but then diverted through shell companies before any actual construction began. The shell companies would pay kickbacks to the politicians who approved the grants, and everyone made money except the low-income families who were supposed to benefit from the housing programs. The congressional hearings that resulted from our investigation made national news for 3 straight weeks. I testified before the subcommittee, presenting evidence that led to the indictments of over 30 people, including 2 state governors, 5 mayors, and 4 federal employees. Marcus Webb, the man whose testimony was supposed to celebrate the housing program's success, instead became the star witness in a federal prosecution that would eventually send him to prison for 15 years. But the moment that changed my life came during the final day of hearings, when Congresswoman Morrison asked me a question I wasn't expecting. "Ms. Martinez, your investigation began with a small-town corruption case that cost you your job and estranged you from your family. Knowing what you know now about the personal cost of pursuing truth, would you make the same choice again?" I had prepared for technical questions about evidence and legal procedures, but this question cut straight to my heart. "Congresswoman," I answered, looking directly into the C-SPAN cameras that were broadcasting live to the nation, 3 years ago, I was a local reporter who thought the biggest story I would ever cover would be a high school football championship. I never wanted to hurt my family or destroy my father's business or spend Christmas alone year after year. But I've learned that some truths are bigger than our personal comfort, and some injustices are too important to ignore just because speaking up is inconvenient. The families who were supposed to get safe, affordable housing from these programs they'd served better than they got. If my investigation helps even one family get the home they were promised, then yes, I would make the same choice again. The clip of my testimony went viral within hours. My phone started ringing with interview requests from major news networks, documentary producers, and publishers who wanted to turn my story into a book. But the call that mattered most came from an unexpected source, the White House press office. President Williams had been following the congressional hearings and wanted to invite me to participate in a special dinner honoring government whistleblowers and investigative journalists. The event would be held on December 23 and would be broadcast live on national television, but I almost turned down the invitation. The idea of being at the White House during the Christmas season, surrounded by celebration and family atmosphere, felt like it would be more painful than rewarding. But Dr. Chen, who had also been invited, convinced me that we owed it to all the people who had been hurt by the corruption to accept the honor. "ISA," she said, "this isn't just about us. This is about showing other people that doing the right thing matters, even when it costs you everything." The night before the White House dinner, I called my mother for the first time in 6 months. I had been calling regularly for 3 years, always getting voicemail, always leaving messages that were never returned. This time, to my shock, she answered on the second ring. "Hello, ISA," she said quietly, and I could hear something different in her voice, not warmth exactly, but not the cold distance I had become accustomed to either. "Mom, I just wanted to let you know that I'll be having dinner at the White House tomorrow night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's going to be on television, and I thought you should know in case you happen to see it." There was a long pause, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, she said, "We'll be watching, Mija. Your father, he's been following the hearings on the news. He says he's proud of what you've done, even though he can't bring himself to call you yet." Those words, that my father was proud of me, meant more than any professional accolade I had received. I started crying right there on the phone, and I could hear my mother crying too. "Mom, I never meant to hurt the family," I said through my tears. "I know I made mistakes, and I know I could have handled things differently, but I couldn't just ignore what I found." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I know, Mija. I think we all know that now. You did what you thought was right, and maybe we should have supported you instead of making you choose between family and truth." The White House dinner was everything I had imagined and nothing like I expected. The state dining room was decorated for Christmas with towering trees and garlands that smelled like home, but the atmosphere was formal and dignified rather than cozy and familiar. I was seated at a table with Dr. Chen, 2 other whistleblowers, and an investigative journalist from the Washington Post who had exposed defense contract fraud. The conversation was intelligent and engaging, but I kept thinking about my family and wondering if they were really watching. President Williams gave a speech about the importance of truth in democracy and the courage required to speak out against corruption. "The people we honor tonight," he said, looking directly at our table, "chose to put the public good above their personal comfort. They risked their careers, their relationships, and their safety to ensure that the American people knew the truth about how their government was operating. Their sacrifice reminds us that democracy depends not just on elected officials, but on citizens who are willing to hold those officials accountable." When the cameras panned across our table during the president's speech, I thought about my family. Sitting in their living room in Cedar Falls, seeing me in a place they never could have imagined. I thought about my father, understanding for the first time that my investigation hadn't been about wanting to hurt people, but about wanting to help people. I thought about my mother, maybe finally realizing that the daughter she raised to tell the truth had simply been following the values they had taught me. The dinner conversation was fascinating, with each of us sharing our experiences of what it had cost to pursue difficult truths. The defense contractor whistleblower had been fired and blacklisted from his industry. The environmental journalist had received death threats and had to move her family 3 times. Dr. Chen had been demoted and transferred to a dead-end position, though she was appealing the decision through federal employment protections. We all agreed that while we didn't regret our choices, none of us had anticipated how isolating the experience would be. The hardest part, I found myself saying during a pause in the conversation, wasn't the professional consequences or even the personal threats I was losing my family. I spent 3 Christmases alone because they couldn't understand why I had to pursue the story when it was hurting people we knew. The journalist from the Washington Post nodded in understanding. "Truth-telling is a lonely profession," she said. "But sometimes you have to choose between being lonely and being able to live with yourself." As the evening progressed, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. These people understood the weight of carrying difficult truths and the price of refusing to stay silent. They understood why I had been willing to sacrifice my family relationships for the sake of justice, and they didn't judge me for it. 4. The first time since my investigation began, I felt like I was surrounded by people who truly saw me and valued what I had done. The president made a point of speaking personally with each honoree during the reception after dinner. When he reached me, he said something that I will never forget. "Ms. Martinez, I've read about your family situation, and I want you to know that the sacrifices you've made haven't gone unnoticed. Sometimes, doing the right thing means standing alone for a while, but eventually, people recognize courage when they see it. I have a feeling your family is beginning to understand what kind of person they raised." His words proved to be prophetic. My phone started ringing before I even left the White House. The first call was from Carlos, who had been silent for 3 years. "Isa," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I saw you on TV tonight, and I realized something. I've been ashamed of the wrong person all this time. I should have been ashamed of myself for not standing by you when you needed family support the most. He told me that he had been following my congressional testimony online and had finally understood the scope of what I had uncovered. You weren't trying to hurt Dad or embarrass the family, he said. You were trying to help people who couldn't help themselves. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. Linda called next, crying so hard I could barely understand her. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I was so worried about what people would think of us that I forgot to think about what was right. You were brave, and instead of supporting you, I made you feel like you had done something wrong. Can you ever forgive me? She told me that she had been watching the hearings with her children, using my testimony as a teaching moment about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. My kids have been asking about their Aunt Isa, who helps people, she said. They want to meet the hero they saw on TV. But the call that mattered most came at midnight, just as I was falling asleep in my hotel room. Mija, my father's voice, said quietly when I answered the phone, I saw you tonight, and I saw the person your mother and I raised. I saw someone who couldn't walk away from injustice, even when walking away would have been easier. I'm proud of you, Isa. I'm proud of the work you've done, and I'm ashamed that it took me this long to tell you that. Dad told me that he had been following every article I had written and every hearing I had participated in since the investigation began. I was hurt and angry about my business, he said, but I never stopped believing that you were a good person trying to do the right thing. I just didn't know how to separate my pain from my pride in you. When I saw you at the White House tonight, talking about helping families get the homes they deserved, I realized that you were doing exactly what your mother and I taught you to do, stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Mom got on the phone then, and for the first time in 3 years, we had a real conversation. She told me about the changes in the family, about how Linda's kids had grown, about Carlos's new job, about Dad's recovery from his heart problems. She told me about the empty chair they had left at the Christmas table for 3 years, hoping each year that I would somehow appear to fill it. We never stopped loving you, Mija, she said. We just didn't know how to love you and be angry at the same time. But seeing you tonight, seeing what you've accomplished and how you've helped so many people, we realized that we were angry at the wrong thing. We should have been angry at the people who were stealing from families, not at our daughter who exposed them. The reunion happened faster than I could have imagined. By New Year's Eve, I was back in Cedar Falls for the first time in 3 years, sitting around my parents' kitchen table just like old times. The house looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. My family looked at me with a mixture of pride and regret, pride for what I had accomplished and regret for the time we had lost. Linda's children, who barely remembered me from before, were fascinated by the famous aunt they had seen on television, and Carlos couldn't stop apologizing for what he called his 3 years of stupidity. The town's reaction to my return was mixed but generally positive. Many people who had shunned me 3 years earlier now approached me to say they had been following my work and were proud that someone from Cedar Falls had made such a national impact. Mayor Richardson, who had been implicated in the original scandal but avoided prosecution by cooperating with investigators, actually thanked me publicly for exposing the corruption that had been happening without his knowledge. Isa Martinez did what good journalists are supposed to do, he said in an interview with the local paper. She asked difficult questions and demanded honest answers. Cedar Falls is better because of her work. But the real healing happened quietly, in private. Conversations with family members who had spent 3 years processing their own emotions about what had happened. Dad told me that losing his business had ultimately been a blessing because it forced him to retire and spend more time with Mom. Linda admitted that she had been jealous of the attention my work was receiving and had used family loyalty as an excuse to avoid dealing with her own feelings of inadequacy. Carlos revealed that he had been afraid my success would make him look bad by comparison, so he had chosen to tear me down instead of celebrating my achievements. Dr. Chen, who had become one of my closest friends during the investigation, joined us for New Year's dinner, and I watched my family embrace her as warmly as they had once embraced me. She told them stories about our work together, about the long nights spent reviewing documents and the scary moments when we felt like we might be in physical danger. Your daughter, she told my parents, is one of the most courageous people I've ever known. She never gave up, even when everyone was telling her to quit. You raised someone special. As we sat around the table that night, I realized that my family's rejection had taught me something valuable about the difference between conditional and unconditional love. For 3 years, I had believed that my family's love was conditional, that they only loved me when I made choices they approved of. But their reunion with me proved that their love had been there all along, buried under hurt and misunderstanding, but never actually gone. They had needed time to understand that my choices weren't a rejection of them but an expression of the values they had taught me. The experience also taught me about the importance of chosen family. Dr. Chan, Congresswoman Morrison, and the other journalists and whistleblowers I had worked with had become a kind of family during my years of isolation. They had supported me when my biological family couldn't, and they had helped me remember my worth when I was tempted to give up. Having both my biological family and my chosen family come together around that New Year's table felt like the completion of a long journey, and my career took off in ways I never could have anticipated after the White House dinner. The book I wrote about the investigation became a bestseller, and the documentary film I produced about government corruption won several awards and was nominated for an Oscar. I started a non-profit organization to support investigative journalists and whistleblowers who face retaliation for their work, funded partly by speaking fees and book royalties. Most importantly, I felt like I had found my true calling, not just reporting the news, but actively working to make the world more just and transparent. The lawsuit against the corrupt officials resulted in over $40 million in recovered funds, most of which was redirected to legitimate housing programs for low-income families. I received dozens of letters from families who were able to move into safe, affordable homes because of the investigation, and those letters meant more to me than any professional award. One letter, from a single mother in Minneapolis who had been on a housing waiting list for 4 years, simply said, "Thank you for not giving up. My children have their own bedrooms now because you cared enough to tell the truth." But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the change in my relationship with my family. We had all learned something about the difference between supporting someone and enabling them, between loyalty and blind obedience, between love and comfort. My parents began volunteering with local housing advocacy organizations, saying they wanted to contribute to the cause their daughter had championed. Linda started a blog about social justice issues and encouraged her children to ask difficult questions rather than just accepting easy answers. Carlos went back to school to study criminal justice, inspired by what he called my accidental career in fighting crime. The Christmas after my White House dinner was the best Christmas I had ever experienced. We were all together again, but we were different people than we had been before, more thoughtful, more appreciative of each other, more committed to doing what was right rather than what was comfortable. As we sat around the tree opening presents, Mom said something that summed up our entire journey. "I used to think that family meant never having to choose between the people you love and what you believe in. Now I know that real family means having people who love you enough to let you make difficult choices, even when those choices are hard for them to understand." Looking back on those 3 years of exile, I can honestly say that while I wouldn't wish that loneliness on anyone, I'm grateful for what it taught me. I learned that truth is worth pursuing even when it costs you everything you think you can't live without. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite fear. I learned that real love can survive misunderstanding and hurt, and that family, whether biological or chosen, is about so much more than shared genetics or shared comfort. The night of the White House dinner, as I sat under those crystal chandeliers, sharing a meal with the President of the United States, I thought about the journey that had brought me there. 3 years earlier, I had been a small-town reporter who stumbled onto a corruption story. I never could have imagined that pursuing that story would cost me my family, my job, and my sense of home, or that it would ultimately lead me to find a deeper understanding of justice, courage, and love. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes you have to lose everything you think you need to find everything you actually need. My family's rejection forced me to discover my own strength and to build a career based on my deepest values rather than my superficial ambitions. Their reunion with me was sweeter because we all understood what we had almost lost permanently. As I watched my family's faces on that New Year's Eve, illuminated by candlelight and filled with love and regret and hope, I realized that our story was really about redemption, not just mine, but all of ours. The documentary I made about government corruption ends with footage from that White House dinner, but the real ending happened months later, around my parents' kitchen table, with my family whole again and wiser for having been broken. Sometimes the best stories aren't about heroes who never fall down, but about families who learn how to help each other get back up. But my story didn't end with that perfect family reunion. Life, as I've learned, has a way of continuing to surprise you long after you think you've reached your happy ending. 6 months after that magical New Year's dinner, I received a phone call that would once again change everything I thought I knew about my purpose in this world. The call came from Detective Ray Sullivan of the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Division. "Ms. Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much, "we've been following your work on the housing corruption case, and we need your help with something much bigger." Are you familiar with the term human trafficking? My blood ran cold. I had covered crime stories before, but human trafficking was a level of evil I had never encountered directly. What Detective Sullivan told me next made me realize that my investigation into missing housing funds had only scratched the surface of a much darker conspiracy. "We've been tracking a network that's been using those same shell companies you exposed," Detective Sullivan explained during our first meeting. But they weren't just stealing federal grant money, they were using the fake construction projects as fronts for trafficking operations. The low-income housing sites that were never built? Some of them were supposed to be safe houses for trafficking victims. The money that was supposed to help vulnerable families instead went to the people who were exploiting them. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Not only had these criminals stolen millions of dollars meant to help people, but they had actively used that theft to fund operations that destroyed lives. Dr. Chen, who had maintained her position at HUD despite the harassment, became my partner once again as we delved into this new horror. But this time, we weren't just dealing with corrupt politicians and greedy contractors, we were facing organized criminals who had killed people to protect their secrets. The first threat came in the form of a photo slipped under my apartment door, a picture of me entering the police station, with a note that simply said, "Stop digging or join the missing." I called Detective Sullivan immediately, and within hours, I was placed under police protection. The investigation revealed that the trafficking network had been operating for over a decade, using federal housing programs as perfect cover for their criminal activities. They would apply for grants to build housing in economically depressed areas, then use the legitimate paperwork to explain the movement of money and people. Victims were told they were being transported to construction jobs or housing assistance programs, only to find themselves trapped in forced labor or worse. The very programs designed to help society's most vulnerable were being perverted to victimize them further. Damn, why families' reaction to this new investigation was completely different from their response 3 years earlier. Instead of asking me to back down, they rallied around me with fierce protectiveness. Dad, who had always been uncomfortable with conflict, surprised everyone by showing up at my apartment with a baseball bat and announcing that anyone who wanted to hurt his daughter would have to go through him first. Mom organized a prayer circle at their church specifically for my safety and the safety of trafficking victims. Linda started a social media campaign to raise awareness about the connection between corruption and human trafficking. While Carlos used his criminal justice training to help me understand police procedures and legal processes, the support of my biological family was crucial, but it was my chosen family that kept me sane during the darkest moments of the investigation. Dr. Chen and I developed a system of checking in with each other every few hours, knowing that either of us could disappear at any time. Congresswoman Morrison used her position to ensure that federal resources were dedicated to our investigation, even as some of her colleagues tried to shut it down. The journalist community that had embraced me after the White House dinner became my protective network, with colleagues in different cities keeping eyes on my movements and ready to raise alarms if anything happened to me. The breakthrough came when Detective Sullivan introduced me to Maria Santos, a trafficking survivor who had escaped from the network we were investigating. Maria was barely 20 years old, but her eyes held the weight of someone who had seen unimaginable horrors. She had been trafficked from El Salvador at age 16, promised a job cleaning houses in Chicago, only to find herself imprisoned in a basement and forced into prostitution. Her escape had been miraculous. During a police raid on what they thought was a drug house, she had managed to identify herself as a victim rather than a criminal. They told me I was going to help build houses for poor families, Maria said. During our first interview, her voice barely above a whisper. They said I would have my own room and earn money to send back to my mother. Instead, they took my documents and told me I owed them thousands of dollars for bringing me to America. Every day they didn't let me leave, the debt got bigger. They said I would work in the houses they were building, but the houses were never built. The money for the houses went to the people who owned me. Maria's testimony was devastating, but it also provided the missing piece of our investigation. She could identify several of the shell companies by name, having overheard conversations between her traffickers about which construction projects were most profitable. More importantly, she could identify locations where other victims were still being held, information that led to the rescue of over 30 people in coordinated raids across 4 states. The media attention this time was unlike anything I had experienced before. The housing corruption story had been big news in policy circles, but human trafficking was a story that captured national attention in a way that financial crimes never could. I found myself on every major news program, telling Maria's story and explaining how corruption and human trafficking were connected. The personal cost of the first investigation had prepared me for the spotlight, but nothing could have prepared me for the emotional toll of bearing witness to such systematic evil. The most difficult part was maintaining my journalistic objectivity while being overwhelmed by rage at what had been done to Maria and countless others like her. During one particularly intense interview on a national morning show, the host asked me how I managed to stay calm while reporting on such horrific crimes. I remember pausing for a long moment before answering, I don't stay calm. I use my anger to fuel my determination to make sure these stories are told and these criminals are stopped. The victims deserve someone who cares enough to be angry on their behalf. That clip became viral in a way that my congressional testimony never had. Social media exploded with people sharing their own stories of injustice and expressing their own anger at systems that failed to protect vulnerable people. I received thousands of messages from people who said my words had inspired them to speak up about corruption or abuse in their own communities. The phrase, angry on their behalf, became a rallying cry for activists and journalists who were tired of being told to remain neutral in the face of obvious evil. The trial that resulted from our investigation was a media circus that lasted for 8 months. Over 60 defendants were charged with crimes ranging from financial fraud to human trafficking to murder. I testified for 3 days, presenting evidence that connected the housing corruption to the trafficking network and explaining how the shell companies had been used to launder money from both stolen federal funds and human trafficking profits. The defense attorneys tried to portray me as a publicity-seeking journalist who had manufactured connections between unrelated crimes, but the evidence was overwhelming that Maria's testimony was the most powerful moment of the entire trial. She spoke for 2 hours about her experience, identifying defendants and explaining how the fake construction projects had been used to justify the movement of trafficking victims. When the defense attorney tried to discredit her by suggesting she was lying for attention, she looked directly at the jury and said, "I don't want attention. I want other girls to be safe. I want the people who hurt me to never hurt anyone else." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, including several of the jurors who were openly crying. The convictions were sweeping. Every major figure in the network received sentences of 20 years or more, with several ringleaders getting life sentences. Over $100 million in assets were seized and forfeited, with the money going to victim services and legitimate housing programs. Most importantly, the investigation led to the rescue of over 200 trafficking victims and the dismantling of a network that had been destroying lives for more than a decade, but the personal cost of this investigation was even higher than the first one. The constant security threats, the emotional weight of hearing victims' stories, and the stress of testifying in high-profile trials took a toll on my mental health that I hadn't anticipated. I started having nightmares about Maria's experiences. And I found myself unable to sleep without checking and rechecking the locks on my doors. Dr. Chin, who had been equally affected by the investigation, suggested we both seek counseling to process the trauma we had absorbed from working so closely with trafficking survivors. The therapy helped, but what helped even more was the sense of purpose I found in working directly with survivors. I used some of the money from my book royalties to establish a foundation that provided housing and job training for trafficking survivors, with Maria as one of the first board members. Watching her transform from a terrified victim to a confident advocate was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. She enrolled in college, started speaking at conferences about trafficking prevention, and eventually became a social worker specializing in helping other survivors. "You saved my life," Maria told me during the foundation's first anniversary celebration, "but more than that, you helped me find my voice. You showed me that my story mattered, that my pain could be turned into purpose." Her words reminded me why I had become a journalist in the first place, not for the fame or the awards, but for the chance to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. The success of the trafficking investigation opened doors I never could have imagined. I was invited to speak at the United Nations about the connection between corruption and human trafficking. The State Department asked me to consult on international anti-trafficking efforts. Universities offered me teaching positions, and publishers competed to sign me for additional books. But the opportunity that meant the most came from an unexpected source, a call from the White House asking if I would be interested in serving as a special advisor on government accountability and transparency. The position would mean moving to Washington and working directly with federal agencies to identify and prevent the kind of corruption that had enabled the trafficking network to operate for so long. It would also mean leaving behind the life I had rebuilt in Chicago and the proximity to my family that I had fought so hard to restore. When I called my parents to discuss the opportunity, I was surprised by their response. Mija, my mother, said, "3 years ago, we asked you to choose between your family and your work, and we were wrong to put you in that position. We're not going to make that mistake again. This sounds like important work, and we're proud that they want you to do it. Family isn't about geography, it's about love and support, and you'll have both of those no matter where you are." Dad's response was even more direct. "ISA, you've found your calling in life. You help people who can't help themselves, and you hold powerful people accountable for their actions. That's exactly the kind of person we raised you to be, and it's exactly the kind of person this country needs in Washington. Take the job, and know that your family is behind you 100%. I accepted the position and moved to Washington in the spring, 2 years after that life-changing White House dinner. My new office was in the Executive Office Building, just steps away from where I had dined with the president, and I often thought about the journey that had brought me from a small-town reporter to a senior government advisor. The work was challenging and often frustrating. Government bureaucracy moved slowly, and entrenched interests resisted change, but it was also deeply meaningful. My first major project was developing a new system for monitoring federal grant programs to prevent the kind of fraud that had enabled both the housing corruption and the trafficking network. Working with Dr. Chin, who had been promoted to a senior position at HUD, we created protocols that required multiple levels of verification for grant recipients and regular on-site inspections of funded projects. The system wasn't perfect, but it made it much harder for criminals to exploit federal programs for their own purposes. The most rewarding part of my new role was working directly with other whistleblowers and investigative journalists who were pursuing corruption cases. I became the person I had needed during my own investigation, someone inside the government who understood the importance of their work and could help them navigate the complex bureaucracy of federal law enforcement. In my first year in the position, I helped facilitate investigations that led to the recovery of over $50 million in stolen federal funds and the prosecution of dozens of corrupt officials. But perhaps the most significant impact of my work was the change it brought to how the government approached transparency and accountability. The president, who had been following my career since that first White House dinner, asked me to lead a task force on government ethics that would make recommendations for preventing corruption at every level of federal service. The task force's report, which became known as the Martinez Report, established new standards for financial disclosure, conflict of interest policies, and whistleblower protections that were adopted by agencies across the government. But even as I settled into what felt like a sustainable career path, I knew that my story as an investigative journalist wasn't over. The skills I had developed and the network I had built were too valuable to abandon completely, and there were still stories that needed to be told by someone willing to take personal risks to uncover hidden truths. I began working on a new book about the connection between government corruption and organized crime, drawing on my experiences with both the housing fraud and the trafficking network. The book, tentatively titled The Price of Truth: How Corruption Enables Evil, was scheduled for publication the following year, with proceeds going to support investigative journalism and victim services. I was also developing a documentary series about government accountability that would profile other whistleblowers and journalists who had risked everything to expose corruption. The series would be a reminder that democracy depends on people who are willing to speak truth to power, even when that truth is uncomfortable or dangerous. The publication of the Martinez Report brought me back into the national spotlight, but this time as a government insider rather than an outsider fighting for access to information. The media coverage was extensive, and I found myself once again testifying before Congress, but now as a senior administration official presenting policy recommendations rather than as a journalist exposing corruption. The role reversal was surreal. I was now the person that investigative journalists were interviewing and holding accountable for government performance. The MY family came to Washington for the public release of the Martinez Report, and watching them in the audience as I presented our findings to a packed auditorium was one of the proudest moments of my life. They had supported me through the loneliness of investigation, the danger of the trafficking case, and now the responsibility of helping to reshape government accountability. After the presentation, Linda told me, "I used to worry that your work would always cost you more than it gave you back. Now I can see that you've found a way to make the world better while also building a life that makes you happy." She was right. For the first time since I had started investigating corruption, I felt like I had found a balance between my professional mission and my personal well-being. The Foundation for Trafficking Survivors was thriving under Maria's leadership, my family relationships were stronger than they had ever been, and my work in Washington was making a real difference in preventing the kind of corruption that had destroyed so many lives. But even as I settled into what felt like a sustainable career path, I knew that my story as an investigative journalist wasn't over. The skills I had developed and the network I had built were too valuable to abandon completely, and there were still stories that needed to be told by someone willing to take personal risks to uncover hidden truths. I began working on a new book about the connection between government corruption and organized crime, drawing on my experiences with both the housing fraud and the trafficking network. The book, tentatively titled The Price of Truth: How Corruption Enables Evil, was scheduled for publication the following year, with proceeds going to support investigative journalism and victim services. I was also developing a documentary series about government accountability that would profile other whistleblowers and journalists who had risked everything to expose corruption. The series would be a reminder that democracy depends on people who are willing to speak truth to power, even when that truth is uncomfortable or dangerous. I sat in my Washington office one evening, looking out at the White House and thinking about the incredible journey that had brought me there. I realized that my exile from Christmas dinner had been the beginning of something much larger than I could have imagined. What had started as a simple investigation into missing housing funds had evolved into a career dedicated to protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable. The MY phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Saw you on the news tonight talking about the new anti-trafficking legislation. So proud of how far we've both come since that first interview. Thank you for never giving up on the story." Her message reminded me that the most important measure of success wasn't the awards or the recognition, but the lives that had been changed for the better because someone was willing to tell difficult truths. The next morning, I received an email that would set the next chapter of my story in motion. It was from an FBI agent in Los Angeles who had been following my work on corruption and trafficking. "Ms. Martinez," the email read, "we have a case that involves both government corruption and international organized crime, and we need someone with your expertise and credibility to help us expose a network that goes deeper than anything you've investigated before. Are you interested in one more story that could change everything?" I stared at the email for a long time, thinking about how far I had come from that lonely Christmas dinner when I thought my career was over and my family was lost forever. I thought about Maria and the hundreds of other survivors whose lives had been saved because someone was willing to dig deeper into uncomfortable truths. I thought about my parents, who had learned to be proud of their daughter's dangerous work, and about Dr. Chen, who had risked everything to support my investigations. Then I picked up the phone and called the FBI agent. "Tell me about the case," I said, and I could hear the excitement in my own voice as I prepared to dive into another investigation that would undoubtedly test everything I had learned about courage, truth, and the price we're willing to pay to protect the innocent. After all, some stories are too important not to tell, regardless of the cost. And I had learned that the cost of silence is always higher than the cost of speaking up, even when speaking up means risking everything you think you can't live without. My family had been lost and found, my career had been destroyed and rebuilt. And my understanding of justice had been tested and strengthened. But through it all, one thing had remained constant: the belief that truth matters, that vulnerable people deserve protection, and that sometimes the most important work requires the greatest sacrifice. I hung up the phone and began preparing for what would undoubtedly be my most challenging investigation yet. I smiled, thinking about next Christmas. For the first time in years, I knew exactly where I would be, surrounded by family, both biological and chosen, celebrating not just the holiday but the knowledge that we had all learned what really matters in life. And if the investigation I was about to begin kept me away from that celebration, I knew my family would understand, because they had finally learned that sometimes love means supporting someone's dangerous work rather than asking them to choose between safety and purpose. The story that began with my exile from Christmas dinner was far from over. But I had learned that the best stories don't end with perfect resolution, they end with the promise of more stories to come, more truths to uncover, and more lives to protect through the simple act of refusing to stay silent when silence would be easier. The FBI case that Agent Rebecca Torres presented to me was unlike anything I had encountered before. We met in a secure conference room in the J. Edgar Hoover building, surrounded by stacks of files that represented 3 years of investigation into what the Bureau was calling Operation Shadow Bridge. The criminal network they had uncovered stretched from Los Angeles to Eastern Europe, involving politicians, law enforcement officials, entertainment industry figures, and international organized crime syndicates working together in ways that defied traditional understanding of how criminal enterprises operated. "What we're dealing with," Agent Torres explained as she spread photographs across the table, "is a convergence of corruption that uses the American entertainment industry as a front for money laundering, human trafficking, and political influence operations. The shell companies you exposed in your housing investigation? They were just the American branch of a much larger network that's been operating internationally for over 20 years. The scope was staggering. We weren't just looking at domestic corruption anymore, but at a criminal conspiracy that crossed borders and involved foreign intelligence services." The investigation had begun when a young actress named Elena Reyes disappeared from a movie set in Los Angeles, only to surface 6 months later in a police raid on a brothel in Las Vegas. When FBI agents interviewed her, she told them a story that initially seemed impossible. She had been recruited for what she thought was a legitimate film project, only to discover that the production company was a front for a trafficking operation that specialized in exploiting aspiring entertainers. The fake film projects were used to lure victims, while the shell companies that funded them were used to launder money from trafficking, drug sales, and political corruption. Elena's story led us to investigate the production company, which led us to the shell companies, which led us to the political connections, Agent Torres continued. "We've identified at least 6 members of Congress, 4 federal judges, and dozens of state and local officials who have been taking money from this network in exchange for protection and favorable treatment. But here's where it gets complicated. We think some of these officials don't even know where the money is coming from. The network is so sophisticated that they've created layers of legitimate businesses and charitable organizations to hide the criminal funding." The personal danger of this investigation was immediately apparent. 3 journalists who had tried to investigate connections between the entertainment industry and organized crime had died in suspicious accidents over the past 2 years. A federal prosecutor who had been building a case against some of the network's political connections had been killed in what police ruled a random mugging, though his files suggested he was close to breakthroughs. Agent Torres made it clear that accepting this assignment would mean accepting the possibility that I might not survive to see the story published. But what convinced me to take the case wasn't the professional challenge or even the potential impact, it was a video that Agent Torres showed me during our second meeting. Elena Reyes, who was now in protective custody, had recorded a message specifically for me after learning that the FBI was trying to recruit me for the investigation. Ms. Martinez, she said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that reminded me painfully of Maria Santos, I know what you did for trafficking victims in Chicago, and I know what it cost you. I'm asking you to do it again, not just for me, but for all the girls who are still trapped in this system. They told me I was going to be a star, but they were selling me to the highest bidder. Please help us stop them. I called my family that night to tell them about the opportunity, and for the first time since our reconciliation, I saw fear in their faces during our video call. Mom started crying immediately, and Dad's jaw tightened in the way it did when he was trying to control strong emotions. Linda was the first to speak. Is it, we just got you back? We just learned how to be proud of our work instead of being afraid of it. Are you going to take on something that could get you killed? Even Carlos, who had become my strongest supporter, looked uncertain as he processed what I was telling them, but it was Mom who surprised me the most. After wiping her tears, she looked directly at the camera and said, Mija, I spent 3 years learning to regret asking you to choose between family and your calling. I'm not going to make that mistake again. If this is what you need to do to help those girls, then we'll support you. But we're going to worry about you every single day, and we're going to pray for you every single night. Dad nodded slowly and added, your mother's right. We raised you to help people who can't help themselves. We can't ask you to stop being who you are just because we're scared of losing you. Dr. Chen's reaction was more complex. As someone who had experienced the threats and harassment that came with exposing high-level corruption, she understood the risks better than my family did. ISA, she said during our secure phone call, I've been following the stories about journalists who died investigating entertainment industry corruption. This isn't like our housing case, where the worst they could do was try to discredit us professionally. These people kill to protect their secrets. Are you sure you're ready for that level of danger? I wasn't sure, but I knew I couldn't walk away from Elena's plea for help or from the hundreds of other victims who were still trapped in the network. Agent Torres had shown me files on over 300 missing persons cases that the Bureau believed were connected to the trafficking operation, including dozens of young women who had disappeared after being promised roles in movies or television shows. Each file represented someone's daughter, sister, or friend who had vanished into a system designed to exploit their dreams and destroy their lives. The investigation began with me going undercover as a documentary filmmaker researching the intersection of politics and entertainment in Los Angeles. The Bureau created a fake production company for me, complete with office space, staff, and a legitimate-looking project about campaign finance reform. My cover story was that I was investigating how the entertainment industry's money influenced political campaigns, which gave me a reason to meet with both the corrupt officials and the criminal financiers who were funding them. The first breakthrough came when I interviewed Congressman David Walsh, who represented a district that included several major movie studios. Walsh had been identified by the FBI as someone who had received significant campaign contributions from companies connected to the trafficking network, though there was no evidence he knew about the criminal activities. During our interview, he mentioned that he had been approached by a group of film industry investors who wanted to fund a documentary about immigration reform, with the understanding that the film would present a particular political perspective. These investors were very specific about the message they wanted the documentary to convey, Walsh told me, apparently not realizing the significance of what he was revealing. They had talking points prepared, specific experts they wanted interviewed, and even suggested locations for filming. I thought it was unusual for investors to be so involved in creative decisions, but they were offering a lot of money. When I asked for the names of these investors, Walsh provided me with a list that included several companies Agent Torres had identified as fronts for the criminal network. Following the money trail from these fake documentary investments led me to a production company called Pacific Bridge Entertainment, which had offices in Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Miami. On paper, Pacific Bridge looked like a legitimate company that produced low-budget films and documentaries. In reality, it was a sophisticated money laundering operation that used fake film projects to justify the movement of millions of dollars in criminal proceeds. The films they produced were either never completed or were such obvious productions that they could never be commercially distributed, but they provided perfect cover for washing dirty money through the entertainment industry's complex financial structures. The MY investigation of Pacific Bridge brought me into contact with Viktor Kozlov, a Russian businessman who claimed to be an independent film producer but was one of the network's key money launderers. Kozlov agreed to meet with me because he thought I was a legitimate documentary filmmaker who might help him establish credibility in Hollywood. What he didn't know was that I was wearing a wire and that FBI surveillance teams were monitoring our every interaction. During our first meeting at an expensive restaurant in Beverly Hills, Kozlov explained how international investors were always looking for opportunities to support American creative projects that aligned with their business interests. He spoke in the kind of euphemistic language that experienced criminals use when they're not sure if they're being recorded, but his meaning was clear. He was offering to fund my fake documentary in exchange for ensuring that it promoted certain political messages that would benefit his network's operations. In my country, Kozlov said, swirling his wine and looking around the restaurant to make sure we weren't being overheard, we understand that information is just another commodity to be bought and sold. Americans have this naive belief that journalism and entertainment are separate from business and politics, but smart people know that everything is connected. You want to make films that tell important stories? I can provide funding. You want those films to reach large audiences? I can provide distribution. All I ask is that you remember who your friends are when you're deciding which stories to tell. The recording of that conversation became one of the key pieces of evidence in the FBI's case against the network. Kozlov was essentially offering to bribe me to produce propaganda disguised as documentary films, using money that the Bureau had traced back to trafficking operations and political corruption. But getting the recording was just the beginning. Agent Torres wanted me to continue the relationship to gather evidence about the network's broader operations. Over the next 6 months, I walked a tightrope between maintaining my cover and gathering evidence without putting myself in more danger than necessary. Kozlov introduced me to other members of the network, including several politicians who had been taking money from the criminal organization and at least 2 federal judges who had been providing favorable rulings in exchange for financial support. Each interaction was carefully planned and monitored by the FBI, but I was always aware that one wrong word or suspicious behavior could expose me as an undercover operative. The most dangerous moment came when Kozlov invited me to what he called a networking event at a private mansion in Malibu. The event was supposedly a fundraiser for a political action committee that supported business-friendly candidates, but Agent Torres's intelligence suggested it was a meeting where the network's criminal and political leadership coordinated their activities. The FBI wanted me to attend because it would be an unprecedented opportunity to gather evidence about the network's operations, but they also warned me that if my cover was blown, I would be in immediate physical danger. The mansion was filled with people I recognized from news reports and congressional hearings, politicians, entertainment industry executives, and several individuals who had been identified by law enforcement as suspected organized crime figures. The conversations I overheard were carefully coded, but the implications were clear. These people were coordinating criminal activities that included human trafficking, money laundering, and political corruption on a massive scale. The breakthrough moment came when I overheard a conversation between Kozlov and a man Agent Torres later identified as Antonio Marchetti, a suspected organized crime boss from New York. They were discussing the girls in the pipeline and the new facilities in Nevada and Arizona, using language that made it clear they were talking about trafficking operations. Even more damaging, they mentioned specific politicians by name, discussing how much money had been paid to each one and what services they were expected to provide in return. But the conversation that chilled me to the bone was between 2 women I didn't recognize, who were discussing the young talent we're developing and the clients who are willing to pay premium prices for exclusive access. They were talking about trafficking victims as if they were commodities to be bought and sold, and their casual tone suggested that this was routine business for them. When one of them mentioned that they had 3 new girls coming in from the Dallas operation next week, I realized that the network was still actively trafficking people even as the FBI investigation was underway. I left the party with recordings that would become crucial evidence in the eventual prosecutions. But I also left with the knowledge that Elena Reyes was not an isolated case. She was one of hundreds of victims who had been lured into the network through fake entertainment industry opportunities. The scale of the operation was staggering, and the level of protection it enjoyed from corrupt officials made it almost impossible for individual victims to escape or seek help. The investigation took a personal turn when Agent Torres discovered that one of the network's targets had been my documentary about government corruption. Kozlov and his associates had been monitoring my work since the congressional hearings, trying to determine whether I posed a threat to their operations. They had even discussed approaching me directly to offer funding for future projects, hoping to co-opt my work rather than try to silence me. They wanted to turn you into one of their propaganda producers, Agent Torres explained during a briefing at FBI headquarters. The plan was to gradually influence your work by providing funding and suggesting topics, until you were essentially working for them without realizing it. It's a sophisticated form of information warfare that they've used successfully with other journalists and filmmakers. The realization that I had been under surveillance by the criminal network for months was terrifying, but it also confirmed that the investigation was targeting the right people. The final phase of the investigation involved coordinating with international law enforcement agencies to simultaneously arrest network members in multiple countries. The operation, which the FBI called Shadow Bridge Takedown, was scheduled for early December, just weeks before Christmas. Agent Torres warned me that my cover would be blown as soon as the arrests began, which meant I would need to go into protective custody until the immediate danger passed. I called my family the night before the takedown to let them know what was happening. I couldn't give them specific details, but I wanted them to know that I would be safe and that the story I had been working on for almost a year was finally coming to an end. Mom cried when I told her I would be in protective custody for Christmas, but Dad reminded her that at least I would be alive to celebrate Christmas with them eventually. Mija, Mom said through her tears, when you come home after this is over, we're going to have the biggest Christmas celebration this family has ever seen. We're going to invite everyone who loves you, Dr. Chan, Maria, and all the people who have become your chosen family. We're going to celebrate not just Christmas, but the end of your most dangerous investigation and the beginning of whatever comes next. The Shadow Bridge takedown resulted in over 100 arrests across 8 countries, with dozens of victims rescued from trafficking operations in multiple states. The evidence I had gathered, combined with testimony from Elena Reyes and other survivors, led to convictions that dismantled one of the largest criminal networks in recent history. 6 members of Congress resigned in disgrace, 2 federal judges were impeached and removed from office, and dozens of state and local officials were prosecuted for corruption, but the most meaningful outcome was the rescue of the victims. Elena Reyes became a powerful advocate for trafficking survivors, working with my foundation to develop programs that helped other victims rebuild their lives. She also became a close friend, someone who understood the cost of pursuing truth in the face of dangerous opposition. During the trial, she told the court, Isa Martinez risked her life to save people she had never met. She gave up her safety and her peace of mind because she believed that our lives mattered. That's the kind of courage that changes the world. The investigation earned me recognition that went far beyond anything I had experienced before. The President awarded me the Presidential Medal of Freedom, calling me a journalist whose commitment to truth and justice has protected the vulnerable and strengthened our democracy. The United Nations invited me to address the General Assembly about the connection between corruption and international organized crime. Universities offered me endowed chairs, and publishers competed to sign me for books about the investigation, but the recognition that meant the most came from an unexpected source, a letter from Mayor Richardson of Cedar Falls, the man whose corruption had started my journey into investigative journalism 5 years earlier. Isa, he wrote, I want you to know that I've been following your career since you left Cedar Falls, and I'm amazed by what you've accomplished. Your investigation of my administration was embarrassing and painful, but it was also necessary. You held me accountable for my failures, and that accountability made me a better person and a better public servant. Thank you for having the courage to tell the truth, even when it was difficult for everyone involved. As Christmas approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me from exile to recognition, from isolation to impact. The family that had once banned me from Christmas dinner was now planning a celebration that would include not just our biological family, but the chosen family of colleagues, survivors, and supporters who had sustained me through the most dangerous period of my life. On Christmas Eve, as I sat in my parents' living room surrounded by people who had risked everything to pursue justice and protect the vulnerable, I realized that my story had come full circle most unexpectedly. The exile that had once seemed like the worst thing that could happen to me had been the beginning of a journey that led to a deeper understanding of family, purpose, and the price of pursuing truth. Dr. Chen raised her glass of wine and proposed a toast to Isa Martinez, who taught us all that sometimes the most important family dinners are the ones you have to fight to deserve. As we clinked glasses and settled in for the evening, I knew that this Christmas celebration was not just an ending to a difficult chapter, but the beginning of whatever came next in a life dedicated to protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The story that began with my family banning me from Christmas had become a story about finding family in unexpected places and learning that the most meaningful celebrations are the ones that honor not just tradition, but transformation. And as I looked around the room at faces that represented courage, sacrifice, and hope, I knew that the best stories don't end with perfect resolution, they end with the promise that there will always be more stories to tell, more truths to uncover, and more lives to protect through the simple act of refusing to stay silent when silence would be easier.